Hi, my name is Monty Merrick, and I'm director of the Humboldt Wildlife Care Center here in Humboldt County, and this is the Humboldt Wildlife Care Center as a project of Bird Ally X. Um, Probably, many of you already you've listened to the podcast and stuff, so this is our first video podcast, so there's some things about it that are going to seem a little bit, we're not going to say shabby, but expect improvements over time. So this is going to be an actual workshop that we deliver for our volunteers. The name of the workshop is Wildlife Rehabilitation Practice and Ethics. Now, it's not actually very practical. There's not information in here about like medical care or diet or how to do certain things, but there are definitely information on how to go about those practices in an ethical way. And it's also focused on the actual ethics of what we do, like what gives us the right to do it, what gives us the right to care for animals, what gives us the permission to do so, like for instance, what state agencies and federal agencies govern our work. I'd like to read this quote. It's from Henry Beston's book, The Outermost House. We need another and a wiser and perhaps a more mystical concept of animals. Remote from universal nature and living by complicated artifice, man in civilization surveys the creature through the glass of his knowledge and sees thereby a feather magnified and the whole image in distortion. We patronize them for their incompleteness, for their tragic fate of having taken forms so far below ourselves. And therein we err, and greatly err, for the animal shall not be measured by man. In a world older and more complete than ours, they moved, finished and complete, gifted with extensions of the senses we have lost or never attained, living by voices we shall never hear. They are not brethren, they are not underlings. They are other nations, caught with ourselves in the net of time and life, fellow prisoners of the splendor and travail of earth. I mean, you can dispute any aspect of that, and maybe in some ways I might even agree with you, like the biblical language or the man this and man that, but what underlies everything, of course, in that is a recognition that we are not the gatekeepers of what it means to be alive, what it means to be wild, what it means to do anything. We act like we are the permitting agency for universal life. Maybe we don't all act like that, but many of us do. It puts it back into the proper perspective. So before we go any further into this discussion, when we're talking about the ethics of a professional ethic, we're not talking simply right from wrong, although we are also talking about that. But we're also talking about a professional perspective on right and wrong. And a photojournalist has an ethical responsibility that is different than the person has who is a photojournalist. So you, as a person, you are such and such. And when you put your photojournalism outfit on, you now have your own ethical standard that governs you. But you also have an ethical standard for the profession that in order to do that job correctly, you need to basically adhere to in some way or another, so that you are able to, operate as a professional in whatever environment you're placed into. So that if you come under fire, you can lean on the protocols that you were, trained and adopted, and you know what to do in those situations. And we'll get into the importance of protocols from an ethical perspective later on. But right now, let's just say that, a photojournalist has a different responsibility at a car crash than an ambulance driver has or a paramedic has. Everybody else is engaged in helping whatever chaos or mayhem or injury or trauma has already occurred. But the photojournalist does not have, and that's them answering to their ethical standards. So that's basically the only point I'm getting at, is that we're talking about this from the perspective of a wildlife rehabilitator's ethical obligations in the course of doing their work, not what your personal ethics are, although that obviously comes into play. So one of the first things we need to do is really we need to talk about wildlife rehabilitation. What is wildlife rehabilitation? Well, there's a lot of ways that you could go about this, but here's a little definition. I wrote this. There's room for improve it if you want. Improve it in the comments below. To admit into care an injured, ill, or orphaned wild animal in order to treat the injury or illness or raise until able to be released back to a wild and free life. It's pretty simple. We get in an injured robin, and if we are able to treat that robin, we do so until they are recovered, and then we set them free. We do nothing else but that, except for, and this is big, end suffering. That's it. Wildlife rehabilitation is generally undertaken in the spirit of one who is indebted. Indebted to the injured animal, who almost always is suffering from an encounter with human activity, and indebted by the rare privilege to be so near to wild beings, and the opportunity to learn from each one who passes through our care. That indebtedness is, you carry that with you, or you're doing something different. And I think that that's a very important distinction to get in at the ground, which is why we have it on, essentially page 1. So after that, though, what we're going to basically do is this is going to divide into 2 sections. And the first section is going to be pretty much non-negotiable things, or at least externally sourced, such as governing agencies, things like that. So, how is wildlife rehabilitation regulated? Well, there's a lot of ways. One is federal regulations. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918, it's an international treaty to protect migratory birds, outlaws the taking of birds so that you cannot possess a feather, you can't possess a nest, you can't possess a bird, you can't possess the body of a bird or parts of a bird. Obviously, that treaty has had, things punched into it so that we can go out and blast ducks and geese out of the sky, for instance, or coots, or, like crows. Whoever has a hunting season obviously has a loophole in the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918 that their slaughter passes through, a huge loophole. And or you can have a loophole that allows you to kill a certain number of bald eagles a year with your industrial apparatus. But the purpose, why we're bringing up this treaty, is because it definitely places the regulation, the management, the trustee agency for birds in the United States is federal because of an international treaty. So birds are protected internationally, and the federal government is responsible for how we deal with that within our own borders. So that what that means is that in order for us to rehabilitate wild birds, we need to get a permit from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Also, there are state regulations, and that covers the rest of what we do. So all of the mammals that we treat are covered under our permit with California, and the agency that oversees what we do is the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. There are many individual regulations that are part of the Fish and Game Code, it's called here in California, and there's every state has something like this, so this may not be exactly the terminology that applies to your state, but here we have a Fish and Game Code, and that has a list of things that we need to do in order to meet the terms of our permit with California Department of Fish and Wildlife. So there's a memorandum of understanding, and in the things in that memorandum of understanding is that we'll follow these codes, that we will not use our animals that we have as patients. We will not take ownership of them. We will not display them to members of the public, and we will not there's a lot of things that we won't do, things that we will and won't do. And we have reports that we have to submit annually and about the work that we've done. And Every facility, at least initially, has to be inspected by CDFW, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, just to ensure that it's meeting the minimum standards. And the minimum standards brings me to a really interesting aspect of this, because right now, last time I looked, there are 23 states of the union have adopted. It's basically it's a very important document. It was written by the National Wildlife Rehabilitators Association and the International Wildlife Rehabilitators Council, and it's called the minimum standard. But what's really interesting is that many states adopted the minimum standards wholly as their code. So basically, the minimum standards is the law in California, and like I said, 23 other states. One of the interesting things about the minimum standards is it includes in it a code of ethics. This can be easily accessed on the internet. And if you're looking at this, you are on the internet, just in case you're wondering. Code of ethics. A wildlife rehabilitator should strive to achieve high standards of animal care through knowledge and an understanding of the field. Continuing efforts must be made to keep informed of current rehabilitation information, methods, and regulations. Well, here's an interesting thing, because what that means, how that translates into us being regulated, is that every year, each one of our volunteers has to have attended we have to have provided for them at least 2 hours of continuing education. So, state regulates us, state provides permits, right? There's rules for how to become a rehabilitator. You need a certain number of things that the state will meet. So now, both of those organizations cover a lot. They're not just in the United States. NWRA operates in Canada as well. IWRC operates, obviously, in a more international way. And these professional organizations, they put on classes, they put on conferences, and they basically exist to help you as a rehabilitator connect with other rehabilitators, keep your education going forward, learn new techniques, new procedures, discussions such as this. And the camaraderie is also an important thing. Talking to other people about what you do and about what they do, and just informally socializing over, Shirley Temples and cheese puffs, vegan cheese puffs. Even just that is a way that it improves your skills, it improves what you're doing, it improves your attitude, and it can build within you a feeling of, a desire for excellence. And inspired people do better work than uninspired people. I mean, that may seem like something that doesn't need to be said, but on the other hand, it's too late. I already said it. And also at the state level, there's states that do not have a professional organization for rehabilitators, but many states do. Here in California, it's the California Council for Wildlife Rehabilitators. So the code of ethics. A wildlife rehabilitator should be responsible, conscientious, and dedicated, and should continuously work toward improving the quality of care given to wild animals undergoing rehabilitation. A wildlife rehabilitator must abide by local, state, provincial, and federal laws concerning wildlife rehabilitation, and associated activities. A wildlife rehabilitator should establish safe work habits and conditions, abiding by current health and safety practices at all times. A wildlife rehabilitator should acknowledge limitations and enlist the assistance of a veterinarian or other trained professional when appropriate. Don't play doctor. A wildlife rehabilitator should respect other rehabilitators and persons in related fields, sharing skills and knowledge in the spirit of cooperation for the welfare of animals. A wildlife rehabilitator should place optimum animal care above personal gain. Well, listen, I can tell you this one thing right here. There is glory in wildlife rehab. I tell people there's no glory in it, but there is glory in it, because is there anything more glorious than knowing what a mallard's tongue feels like? I mean, really knowing. So, yes, a wildlife rehabilitator should strive to provide professional and humane care in all phases of wildlife rehabilitation, respecting the wildness and maintaining the dignity of each animal in life and in death. Releasable animals should be maintained in a wild condition and released as soon as appropriate. Non-releasable animals have a right to euthanasia. We're going to go into the euthanasia a little bit more in depth further downstream. A wildlife rehabilitator should encourage community support and involvement through volunteer training and public education. The common goal should be to promote a responsible concern for living beings and the welfare of the environment. Well, that's a big task now, isn't it? But it is something that we do. Preventing injury is something that is very important, and stopping the disruption of wild families through actually going out and promoting a kind of coexistence and helping people resolve conflicts with wild animals without resorting to violence or trapping is we spend a lot of resources on that, and it pays off in wild lives saved. A wildlife rehabilitator should work on the basis of sound ecological principles, incorporating appropriate conservation ethics and an attitude of stewardship. A wildlife rehabilitator should conduct all business and activities in a professional manner with honesty, integrity, compassion, and commitment, realizing that an individual's conduct reflects on the entire field of wildlife rehabilitation. And not just realizing that, but also realizing that if you're getting funded at all, it's because you're a nonprofit. Your facility is a public benefit corporation, and technically speaking, you exist because the people of the state that you operate in want you to be there. And when they call up and they have a question, it's like it's you may not like it, but it's like your boss called, kinda. In any case, what they are owed is your honesty and your integrity. They're making your work possible just by being a citizen of the state that permits you. Compassion, commitment. If you don't have those things by the bucket load, you aren't going to make it very far. But you probably do, because you've made it this far already. Anyway, that's the code of ethics, ladies and gentlemen. And let us turn the page. Let's just hit on this for a minute. How is wildlife rehabilitation funded? Is that an ethical consideration? I mean, there's organizations that offer grants. Almost all of our funding comes from people deciding to give. And, I think this is a really important aspect of staying honest and keeping your integrity and being true to the mission, because we have to go ask for this money. People are not giving them. People forget we exist. People forget opossums exist. People are not driving down the street going, possums. I mean, some of us are. That's true. Some of us are. Without even seeing one hit on the side of the road, So get out there and fundraise, because the only way to fundraise is to tell the truth about our work. And that's a benefit. Okay. So anyway, now we're going to move into ethics in the daily life of the clinic. There's an unavoidable aspect to wildlife rehabilitation. There's no way in the world you can do wildlife rehabilitation with the consent of your patient. So you are basically grabbing someone, holding them captive against their will, touching them when they don't want to be touched, prodding them when they don't want to be prodded, feeding them when you want to feed them. They have no agency at all while they're in care with you. The only thing that can justify our actions are our intentions. So when we pick up a wild animal who is injured on the ground, what we are making is a promise to them. We're going to do one of two things. We are going to end their suffering, or we're going to give them a second chance, which was not available without us picking them up. It's an assumption on our part that second chance delivered is, in fact, enough to forgive that we grabbed that animal without their consent and held them captive until they could be released. This is the part of this workshop that if you could take that in and just let that live in your heart, so that every time that you handle a patient, you are aware that patient is not happy that you're doing what you're doing. There is not, even if you're feeding them, that isn't what they want. They don't want you. So one of the things about being trapped in a non-consensual relationship, super stressful. Like, it's physiologically detectable stress. In captivity long enough, and animals can develop, fractures, which are basically stress fractures. Animals can have all kinds of health problems related to captivity. But one of the things that you have to just basically accept from the beginning to do wildlife rehab is that these patients are terrified of us. And, we can have experiences. I remember, way back in my puppyhood of being a wildlife rehabilitator, a certain red-tailed hawk. And every time I opened the door to get him out, to weigh him, to clean his housing, to force feed him a mouse, he greeted me with, one of us is going to die. It's you or it's me. He was 100% warrior bird, ready to do battle unto death every single time we greeted each other. He was living in such a state of readiness that that was more stressful. You know yourself from your own experiences that when you're living in a state of hyper awareness and hyper readiness, that state costs you more than being in a state of ease. So when we're working with these animals, when we're working with them as patients, defensive behaviors, warning vocalizations, struggle, resistance to being handled, these are useful indicators that the patient hasn't become habituated. They can be useful indicators of a relative state of health. But what they are not is they're not fun. They're not like, oh, look who's feisty today. Oh, yeah, real bitey today, aren't we? That is not what we have there. What we have there is an animal who's prepared to fight to the death. And it's not cute. It's a level of bravery that most human beings don't ever have to exhibit. So, and some unfortunately do. So how do we handle this? Well, some of the ways are very simple. Quite simply, like we hang a pillowcase on the front of their indoor housing. If they're in a wall unit, we put a pillowcase there so that every time we walk in there, they don't have to look at us. Visual barriers do a lot to reduce the stress of our patients. When we have them on the table doing an exam, even while we're looking at their feet, we can keep their head covered. It's not everything, but it's something. And every little bit when we reduce stress is something. Obviously, when you look at the patient's face, you do have to uncover their head. So obviously, we can't make this completely stress-free for the patient. And another thing that's really important is we have to communicate with our fellow workers. We have to say, okay, I have his hands, I have his feet, and you have his head. We have to communicate, but quietly, not a lot of extraneous noise. Just keep it to a minimum, and that can reduce stress by a lot. It's never too late to figure out how much damage just being ourselves in our clinics, how much stress that can cause. I was in one of our patients' indoor housing units. So I was in a room that we have set up where we bring in fawns when we admit a fawn, and when we're getting them accustomed to not nursing from their mother, but now taking a bottle. And one of my colleagues walked down the hallway outside. Not ran down the hallway, didn't play bongos down the hallway, just walked down the hallway. And her footsteps as she went past where I was with the fawn caused that fawn to jump out away from me and ran into the corner just from the sound of those footsteps. And I'm like, this fawn has been in care now for 36 hours, and somebody has walked down that hallway perhaps 6 times, if not more. So even though here I am almost 25 years in this field, and I saw that for the first time, just a few months ago, that happened. And even though I know that noise is stressful, even though I teach all of the time that we have to reduce the amount of noise we make, we have to do this, I saw that, and the revelation of it was, it was startling. And it's always a great reminder. And that's why it can be really difficult, because here's one of the things that's true, man. Nobody likes to be shushed. So when you're at work, if somebody's talking and you go, shush, 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 patience, right? They're gonna, but nobody likes it. I don't like it, even when I know better, right? But I don't like it when it happens to me. I'm like, no, it's, that's just not how we are. We don't like that kind of thing. But do it anyway. We have to shush each other. We do. So I'm going to flip the page here. So keeping wildlife wild. For the most part, when we say keeping wildlife wild, we mean that they have a healthy distrust of everything human. So that not only Are they not going to come up to people for food, but they're not going to come up to back porches for food? We're talking about is just keeping that healthy fear of all things human at the point of release. We're not creating what some would term as nuisance animals, but what we would term as unsafe to themselves. You know, an animal that comes around people is going to get in trouble, hit by their cars, caught by their cats, caught by their dogs, trapped, shot, poisoned. I mean, human society does not have a great track record on this. So there's the kindness that kills. You know, we admitted a skunk who was literally 3 times her natural body weight because she had been in somebody's backyard being fed cat food, and she was enormous. I mean, that was not, it served her not even a little bit to be in that person's backyard. So keeping wildlife wild protects them from human food sources, human pets, human kindness that kills, human abuse, and human machinery. When we talk about what not being wild, what do we mean? Habituation and imprinting. Habituation is essentially becoming tolerant of a human presence. And habituation can affect any age of an animal. How do we combat it? Well, we minimize handling. We minimize conversation near patients, always. The sound of our voice, if it's not terrifying, then it's habituating. So we do minimize conversation near parents. The visual barriers, again, do a world of good. They allow us to enter into the room that their housing is in without being seen. If you've been in the hospital, you understand, you love your visual barrier if you're sharing the room with somebody else. And when possible and appropriate, it's really housing with the same or similar species is really important. It's not always possible, and it's not always advisable. Not every animal wants to be housed with one of their own kind or something similar. Some animals are solitary and would prefer that to not be the case. But whenever you can, you should. And this brings us to imprinting. And imprinting, now, I'm not sure that I can agree with everything I'm about to suggest, because imprinting suggests that the patient is now identifying with the caregiver. And you may think you know that that's happening, but most of us have a difficult time knowing what our friends and loved ones think. And we speak the same language and we can ask them. So knowing what is going on inside the mind of a Western gull, to me, that's a huge act of hubris to think that you know what's happening in their mind. But let's just go ahead and commit that act of hubris, and we'll say that what is happening in that mind is that animal is identifying themselves as your species. They're part of you. And this doesn't happen. You can't imprint an adult. It's too late for that. They already know who they are. But hatchlings and newborns, theoretically, this can happen too. And it can be very difficult to recover from, if not impossible. So you definitely don't want to do this to your patient. There's things that we can do to mitigate this. Sometimes the use of puppets, the use of, as I mentioned with that fawn, I have my little brown deer-colored blanket that I throw over myself just to not give them a human form to see and think of or recognize as the deliverer of milk. So we try to keep that separated. Preventing this, well, it's great to have siblings if they're babies. It's always going to be them against you. And while, yeah, it's uncomfortable, they're not having fun when they're seeing you. As if you habituated them, you might get them to be like, oh, here comes the dude with the food. That might be great, but it's not. That's my mallard impersonation, by the way. Having each other will keep them from coming to you. One of the greatest tools we have to prevent habituation, imprinting, is foster parents and renesting. Either getting babies back to their families when possible, or sometimes we can foster babies with another wild family. This is, we've had a lot of different success with Canada geese, for instance. That has worked out great. And we've done fostering, but with raptors. You can put a raptor baby into another raptor's nest, and they will get cared for as if they were their own. So there's different things that you can do to prevent imprinting. So we mentioned that we were going to talk about euthanasia, and we are. Why do we euthanize patients? Well, the number one reason we euthanize patients is because they have a wound that is not treatable so that they could be released again. Very common. They get admitted and they have an injury that no matter what we do, they will never be able to operate with wild freedom again. And those patients are euthanized. An equally important reason is the right to freedom. There's nothing that happens between that wild animal getting injured and us finding them that undoes their right to freedom. And nothing about what we do, none of our intentions, undoes that right to freedom, which means that we do not have a right to impose captivity. And the only time that we grant ourselves that right to impose captivity is for the period of care, with the promise that that captivity will end. Obviously, there are people who feel differently about this. Frankly, I regard it as a huge mistake that rehabilitation made back in the 1970s when they got it organized that they could do things like take non-releasable animals out as education animals. I personally disagree with that because it does not teach what is meant to be taught. It does not teach respect for freedom, first of all. First thing it teaches is that it's cool to have an owl on your hand. I'm always wondering why that animal is with those people instead of free. So in any case, euthanasia takes care of that. Euthanasia takes care of non-releasable injuries. It takes care of the right to freedom. There I was flying, and I crashed into a high-tension wire. And I got an electric shock, and I fell to the ground. I had hit it right on my wrist and burned all the feathers off of that wing. And now there I am laying on the ground, and the wound is getting worse and worse, as electrocution wounds do. And then I am found, and I am picked up, and I am hauled off. And from the minute that I hit that wire, I was headed one direction only, and that was to death. And if somebody picks me up and brings me into a facility and puts me in a box, and then I am never, ever getting out of that box again. This takes us back to the bit about consent. That is all done without consent. And the stress of captivity is now their permanent condition. So how do we euthanize? First of all, let's look at the word euthanasia. Euthanasia is basically a word that is Greek. I mean, it's English now as well, but it has a Greek origin, and if you take its components apart, it means good death. And for a death to be good, it has to be good for the one doing the dying. When they talk about euthanizing animals to collect as specimens, they're wrong. They've killed that animal. It's not euthanasia. Just because it was painless doesn't make it good. The one doing the dying has to benefit from the death. That's it. So how do we do it? Well, we do it quickly, painlessly, and humanely. As little stress as possible, we're going to handle the animal during the moment that they die. They're going to spend, unless we can do it differently, they're going to spend their last moment of conscious sentience on this earth in the hands of you. So we want to do that as the same way we do any procedure, as quickly and as humanely and as painlessly as possible. There's a lot of methods. There's some methods that are considered quick, painless, and humane that can't possibly be. It's like, for instance, cervical dislocation, fancy talk for breaking their neck. Is that humane? Grabbing an animal's head and twisting it until their neck breaks? Well, no, of course not. Not in most situations. But if you don't have any other method and you're 300 miles from the nearest facility and you have an animal that's struggling and in a great deal of pain, and you can quickly, because you know how to do it, perform cervical dislocation and stop it from happening, then yeah, and in that situation, sure, it is humane. And it's relatively painless, and it's relatively quick. So, all of these things we are scalable. We take it and we apply it. Captive bolt is considered humane in the cattle industry. But all of this that saw No Country for Old Men understands how wrong that is. So it does often involve controlled or dangerous drugs. We use an inhalant that would also be used for anesthesia. AVMA publishes guidelines on acceptable methods of euthanasia, and you'll even find those in the minimum standards. So controlled and dangerous substances do require you to have some degree of control. over those substances themselves, which means that's going to be a logbook, it's going to be tracking what you're using, and it's going to mean keeping those things under lock and key in a safe, lockbox, whatever. But that will be a big part of it. And somebody's drug enforcement agency license is going to be on the line for those things. And so the safe handling of them is really critical. Okay, well, we are getting down to the end here. And there's a few more things that we want to talk about. And one of those is the decisions on who has a right to our care, which is it's a discussion about between native and introduced species. It super depends. Like I said, I've been at this for almost 25 years. And in those years, I have held just about every opinion that is available in this field of wildlife rehab on who should be rehabilitated and who shouldn't. And I know people who don't believe any distinction should be made between native and introduced species when it comes to providing care. And I completely and totally respect that. And I even had that opinion for a good number of years myself. But I also am sensitive to the concerns of conservationists who note that some species have a deleterious impact on native species. We do have songbirds in decline. And European starlings and English house sparrows are a reason why. And mourning doves are in decline. And Eurasian collared doves are a reason why. So those are species that we think long and hard about treating because their presence is causing mayhem in the natural world. So we think about it. And you can think about it too. And wherever you come down, there's no law against treating those animals. So if you come down on the side of they deserve our care because they don't know that they're introduced, and also for people who live in cities, you take away, starlings and sparrows, and what birds do they even have? And I see those arguments and I understand them. So if that's what you're leaning on, I don't see any problem with that. Lean on them. Treating native wildlife is an important part of our mission, and making certain that we have the resources available to do that is also important. And non-native animals may take resources that some might think belong to the native animals. But how we prioritize that, like even CDFW will say, that's your business, but you do want to think about it. You can do searches in scientific papers to determine the deleterious nature of a non-native patient or their relative harmlessness. That doesn't mean that non-native patients don't get treated by us, though, because a patient whose wing is all jacked up, and needs to be euthanized, we're going to take care of them. And it doesn't mean that if somebody brings us a fledgling house sparrow who has absolutely nothing wrong with them other than that it happens to be that 1 week in their lifespan when they might be easily caught because they're not quite adept at flying. If somebody brings us, we're just going to take that guy back and put him back with his family. We're not, we are compassion driven. We're not here to go out and round up all the non-natives and eliminate them. So that's not really what we're talking about. There's obviously other considerations. Everything we do in our clinics or in our small facilities, in our garages, if that's where we have our place set up, everything that we do is subject to ethical review. Everything we do can be looked at. Am I going about this the right way? Am I using best practices? Am I treating, am I following the code of ethics? What other people in this field think about what I'm doing actually does matter. Am I considering all of these things? And you can always increase your level, just like you can always increase your level of awareness, you can always increase your level of sensitivity, you can always find room for more compassion, and you can always do a better job. And that's both in practice and in theory, both ethically and practically. It's always possible to improve what you're doing. When somebody brand new comes in and asks you a question while you're doing it that way, it can be easy to be like, hey, whippersnapper, when you've been doing this 20 years like I have, you don't ask questions. No, actually, that's wrong. When you've been doing this 20 years like I have, you welcome questions like that. You ask them yourself. Am I doing this right? You do. You ask them yourself. Are you doing this right? So we've only scratched the surface. This is an ongoing review all day long, every day. Every day we ask ourselves these questions. Are we doing this right? Can we improve what we're doing? Can we do this better? Become involved with fellow rehabilitators. Go to conferences if you can do it, and there's scholarships available for people that have, limited means. If you're in a facility, facilitate a discussion about ethics, like through a workshop like this. It's definitely a conversation. And when you answer these questions as an experienced caregiver or as a brand new caregiver asking them, really answer them, really ask them, dig in deep and find out what it is. That's where all of the joy resides. Being able to, know that you did your best, know that you tried your best, and know that you are available to learn something new. And with that, I think, we should probably wind this down. It's challengingly long at this point. If you stuck with it for this long, I appreciate you. And definitely, sign up to, we'll be doing more of these discussions of the practices and the theory behind the practice of wildlife rehabilitation as we expand our podcast into the video realm. Okay, so thank you, everybody, and thanks for the work that you do. Appreciate it. Signing off.